if you have a leader who's self-aware, who's not getting in their own way, who knows what they stand for, who shares their values and says, my most important purpose in life is to make a positive difference, wouldn't you want to follow that person?
Many managers, they fear being too kind will hurt the performance as well.
If you just tell everybody what they want to hear, you're going to have chaos, you're going to have anarchy.
Some leaders micromanage. How can they step back and give the ownership to their employees?
Clear expectations
Yeah.
and frequent check-ins.
Many of us have seen managers, they lose their temper at the meetings.
Everybody that worked for him was miserable. There was even one gentleman who told me he was taking blood pressure medicine.
Do happy employees really perform better?
I think we're asking the wrong questions about that. What we should be asking is, no matter what model of working we have, are we giving our employees an opportunity to choose?
Dr. Tasha Yurek, organizational psychologist researcher and New York Times best-selling author. Welcome to Nafs podcast.
Thank you, marhaba.
Dr. Tasha, we are going to talk about self-awareness today and emotional intelligence at work. My first question is why self-awareness is so critical for leaders.
Self-awareness and emotional intelligence are related. Emotional intelligence, as probably everyone who's listening to this knows, is understanding our emotions, being able to control our emotions, understanding other people's emotions, knowing how to control, well, not in a bad way, but how to manage other people's emotions. And self-awareness is a construct that's even bigger than that. So it includes emotional intelligence, but it also includes things like knowing what we value, knowing what we're passionate about, knowing our patterns of behavior, knowing how we react to things, knowing our impact. But I do think that the emotional side of self-awareness, which we call emotional intelligence, is probably one of the most important pieces of self-awareness. And the reason is that we live in a completely chaotic world that we know objectively is getting more chaotic with every passing year, as we found. And so people who are not able to sort of control their own emotions, people who let that stress get to them in a way that they become very reactive, the costs are really high. And, the costs, I think, are higher, for example, than not knowing your values or not knowing, your passions. It really impacts your relationships in a negative way. It impacts your well-being. And so that's why it's a superpower to be able to be in a stressful situation, to be able to stay level-headed, to be able to communicate calmly and clearly. And I will be the first to say that I'm not perfect at that. I'm certainly not even amazing at that. And so it's a battle that we're all fighting.
Yeah, I think no one is perfect in self-awareness.
Correct. And we'll talk about this, but pretty much all of us have more work to do than we think.
What changes when they have better self-awareness?
So it's really the flip side. You think about first of all, your being in the world becomes more joyful. It becomes more peaceful, and you're able to have more control over what's happening. So, you imagine someone who is very emotionally intelligent, they're going to also have better relationships. If they have a disagreement with a friend, for example, somebody with low emotional intelligence might set a boundary, right? And, decide they're going to yell at someone and cut them out of their lives. Somebody with high emotional intelligence would be able to have a calm, grounded conversation and hopefully repair that relationship, assuming it's something that they want to repair. The same goes for, any romantic relationships. If we're married and we are emotionally intelligent, we're able to communicate with our spouses. We're able to move past arguments. I think we all have that friend who maybe is a little bit less emotionally intelligent and you hear them fighting about the same thing all the time. It really just gives us, I think at the end of the day, power, control, and peace.
Can you share a story where the lack of emotional intelligence hurt a workplace?
Oh my gosh. Well, so I've been coaching CEOs for the last 22 years, and I have more stories than could probably fill every other podcast you do from now on. But I tell a story in my book, Insight, about an executive I coached who I renamed for his anonymity, Steve. And Steve he had just been promoted to be basically the head of his company's most important division. And, up until then, he had been fairly successful. He certainly wasn't someone that everyone wanted to work for, but he, was kind of getting by. But sometimes we get promoted to a level where the stress becomes so high, where we're not being supervised as closely, and where the beast in us comes out instead of the best in us. And so when I first met him, the CEO hired me and said, listen, Steve is yelling at his employees. He is belittling them. He becomes so upset, if they bring him bad news that he can't even communicate with them. And unsurprisingly, people were quitting left and right. And basically what the CEO told me was, I need you to go in there and, fix this. I don't know how you're going to fix it, but somebody needs to fix it. Because if not, he's not going to have a job anymore. And I think that's a really good example of just, that was the before. I can tell you about the after. It's a really happy story.
I would like to know.
But the before was, it's sort of metaphorically a trail of dead bodies. Not only wasn't he getting the results that he wanted, because nobody wanted to go the extra mile, but everybody that worked for him was miserable. There was even one gentleman who told me he was taking blood pressure medicine because of the Steve stress.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of Steves.
I know, they're everywhere. Everyone's like, I know a Steve.
Yeah. Many of us have seen managers, they lose their temper at the meetings. What's your advice for staying calm under pressure?
So that's a great question. And I actually, I explore that really very much in depth in my newest book, Shatterproof. And basically, when we find ourselves flying off the handle, it's never random, is it? It's always because something is happening in our environment. And I think it's easy, to blame, if it's our boss, to blame our boss, or if we're flying off the handle, to blame ourselves. But almost always when something like that happens, it's because something in our environment is frustrating one of our fundamental human needs. And so, I was coaching a CEO who was very reactive in that way. He would sort of hijack his team meetings and, start just belittling everyone, not unlike Steve, right? But it was like he couldn't control himself. And he said, "What is wrong with me?" And I said, "There's nothing wrong with you. You are a human being who is extremely stressed out, and you're not getting your needs met." So what I recommend for people is really two things. Number one, if you find yourself consistently, usually it's if you have an outsized reaction to something, right? If, somebody says something just offhandedly that probably wasn't intended to upset you, or even wasn't objectively that upsetting, and you just have this outsized reaction, that's a signal. And the signal is to look for the trigger behind it. So triggers can be everything from, criticism to feeling disempowered, to having somebody isolate us from our friends or from the group. And basically, if you take that one step further, which is the second part, the needs that are being frustrated behind those things are, for criticism, as an example, it's our fundamental need for confidence. We need to feel like we're doing well and we're getting better and we're growing. If we feel disempowered, we're having a frustrated need for choice. Human beings are wired to need to have agency and authenticity, regardless of the culture that we grow up in. And then the third thing about being isolated, you can trace that to our third need, which is connection. So confidence, choice, and connection. And when I'm working with my clients who are reactive and, these very high profile, very powerful, very smart CEOs, is we reverse engineer it. So let me give you another example. I'm working with a client right now who has discovered that his biggest trigger is when he feels like something unfair is happening. And so because he figured that out, he was able to say, that actually threatens my need to feel confident because, this person is maybe getting something that I'm not getting, and that's not fair. It interfered with his feeling of choice. He said, I can't step in and make it fair. And, something around me is happening that I can't control. But basically what that allowed us to do was say, okay, again, you are not crazy. You are not unable to control yourself. You just have this trigger. And, we could talk for hours about where our biggest triggers come from. For him, we sort of went back to his child. I don't do this all the time with my clients, but he really wanted to say, like, where did this come from? So we went back to his childhood and we looked at his family dynamics, and it sort of made sense because he lived in a family where nothing felt fair to him.
Wow.
Right? And so that's a very long way of saying that if we find ourselves getting consistently triggered, we should start to notice what those patterns are, trace it to that need. And then there's more we could talk about with this. But basically, if I feel like my choice is being threatened, what can I do today to feel a greater sense of choice? I might not be able to control this unfair meeting that I'm having, but maybe I can take 10 minutes to myself after the meeting and really try to calm down as much as possible. So the point is, there's nothing wrong with us. We're human beings with frustrated needs.
How does real empathy at work translate into better results?
Building on the last answer,
Yeah.
empathy helps meet our need for connection. Connection is made up of basically two things. Number one is feeling like we belong, like we're part of something. And that can be something as simple as, going to a conference and feeling like you fit in, or having a group of people at work that you get along with. The second component is feeling mutual support and understanding. So what empathy is and people squabble about this definition, right? Empathy versus compassion. But empathy is, the ability to put yourself in someone's shoes and feel what they're feeling. So when we do that, the other person is more likely to feel seen, heard, supported, safe. And if you think about it in a work context, especially for leaders, empathy is really a superpower. Because if you, we can look at it the other way. If you are unempathetic, how likely is your team to want to tell you hard things?
Yeah.
How likely is your team going to give you feedback, right? And leaders who don't have information flowing, up, down, and sideways, and having people comfortable telling the truth are really at a disadvantage. So empathy, I think, is really one of the most important leadership skills, especially today.
Giving tough feedback is never easy. How can leaders be honest but still keep people motivated?
A couple of ideas here. I learned this one from my mentor and honorary father, Marshall Goldsmith, who is the number one leadership thinker in the world, the number one coach in the world. He's just the number one everything. But he has this really wonderful idea called feed forward. So before I talk about that, I'm going to talk about feedback and why it can create defensiveness and not be as helpful as we think. So when we're giving feedback, we're basically telling someone, with varying degrees of effectiveness, this thing you did was really bad and don't do it again, right?
Yeah.
So automatically what that does is it creates a couple of dynamics. One is the person might sort of disagree. Well, I didn't do that, or I didn't mean to do that. And the second thing it does is it makes them defensive because their past actions are being judged. So for a leader who really wants, especially if you have a very defensive person that's working for you, the idea of feed forward is you don't waste your time harping on all the bad decisions they made in the past. you say something like, you had this client presentation today. And maybe you ask them first to, critique themselves. How did it go? What went well? What would you change? That gives you, that actually gives you a window into how self-aware they are. They might already know. So then you don't have to sit there and sort of tell them. But the next question with feed forward is, okay, what ideas can we come up with for how you can be even better next time? And in my experience, and the science supports this too, is when you talk about the future, it's not as threatening. It becomes really a collaborative conversation of like, oh, instead of saying this, maybe next time I could say this to the client, and it would be a totally different reaction. So you become partners that are solving a problem instead of one person telling the other person that they're bad. And there's a lot more to that, but I think just in terms of being practical for your listeners and your viewers, that would be where I would start.
Is self-awareness something we are born with it, or it's we can develop it later on as leaders?
Mm-hmm. So self-awareness is knowing who we are and how we're seen. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we do know, I've been empirically researching this skill for 12 or 13 years now, and every year that goes by, I'm more confident that self-awareness is extremely learnable. Mm-hmm. So, you think about someone like Steve, maybe someday we'll come back to his happy ending because he deserves that. Your listeners deserve that. No matter where we start, we can always get better. And the reason I know that, we've done a lot of kind of quantitative research, surveys and literature reviews, but we also interviewed 50 people, 50, who didn't start out as self-aware. Think of the least self-aware person mm-hmm. and imagine that they became like one of the most self-aware people. We found 50 of those people, and we really deeply analyzed what they were doing differently. And it was funny because our research assistants they didn't think we were going to find these people. And I knew we would because I've been coaching. I've been seeing these transformations for my entire career. No matter where somebody starts, with the right strategy, with the right commitment, they can always improve their self-awareness. And one last thing I'll say is it's actually not as dramatic as we think. It's really what we found is the most remarkable transformations happen incrementally. So if you say, set the bar low. Say, what if I became 1% more self-aware every week? But then if you add that up over months and years, that becomes a really incredible transformation.
For someone who wants to grow their self-awareness, what simple daily practices do you recommend or suggest?
So there are really two types of self-awareness. And unfortunately, to be self-aware, we can't just focus on one. We have to do both. So what I'll do is I'll explain each one, and then I'll give a really practical tool that your listeners can use. So the first is called internal self-awareness. And I think that's what people think of normally when they hear that term. It's just knowing who we are, knowing what we want, knowing, sort of how we're going to behave in certain situations. A tool that all of our self-awareness unicorns use to some extent was something that we named the daily check-in. And what's beautiful about this is you don't have to go sit on a psychologist's couch for 2 hours a week for the rest of your life to have this insight. It takes less than 5 minutes. And if you can do it most days, like I'm a pragmatist.
Is it like self-reflection?
Yeah, exactly. I'll tell you what it is. Yeah. Sorry, I'm building the suspense, but probably not being clear. But if you can do this, most days, 5 days a week, you're going to be in really good shape. So it's 3 questions. When you're brushing your teeth, when you're getting ready for bed, when you're commuting home. The first question is, what went well today for me? The second question is, what didn't go so well? And the third question is, how can I be smarter tomorrow? And the beauty of that, the beauty of those 3 questions is that they give us this kind of quick hit insight without falling down something I call the rabbit hole of rumination. We're not saying, oh, now I have to think about my childhood and I have to think about all that. We're just saying today. Today is the unit of analysis. So that's internal self-awareness. External self-awareness is having an understanding of how other people see us. And people who are externally self-aware tend to have fewer blind spots. So this isn't a daily practice, but it's something that you can do as regularly as you want. It's something that I would never tell other people to do unless I've done it multiple times. And it's going to sound really scary the first time you hear it. So I call it, ready?
Ready.
The dinner of truth.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about it. Yeah.
Right? And this was actually, I named it that, but it was developed by a colleague and friend of mine named Josh Meisner. And he has every one of his undergraduate students do this every semester. So the way it works is you pick someone who you're close to, who you want to improve your relationship with. You take them out to a meal. It doesn't have to be dinner, but I just like dinner of truth as a name. And you sit them down and you explain just very briefly, I value our friendship. I value our relationship. I wanted to ask you a question in the spirit of me getting better. Ready for the question?
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what do I do that is most annoying to you? And then you wait. And then what you don't do, well, they might have, they might say, what the heck are you asking me? And you say, it's okay.
It's really hard.
I want to hear anything.
Really hard.
The first time I heard that, my stomach dropped when I imagined doing it, right? I just thought, because I think we have this fear that the people in our lives are going to say something like, I'm glad you asked. I've never really liked you that much. I think there's so many things that annoy me about you that I can't even choose, right? But what I've found, and I've done this exercise probably a dozen times, is what they'll give you is usually actionable, helpful, and at the end of the conversation, your relationship is stronger. So I'll give you an example. The first time I did this, I did it with a friend of mine who is, we would say in the US, crotchety, right? He's kind of cranky, like he's very negative.
Is he still your friend?
Yes, this is my friend. This is still my friend. We all have that friend, don't we? And I did it intentionally because I wanted to see like, what's the worst thing that could happen? And so I asked him the question and he very dutifully thought for a moment and he said, Tasha, I've been wanting to tell you this. And I'm glad you asked. This was 10 years ago. He said, I love you in person, but I hate you on social media.
Hmm.
And I thought, ooh, right? And then I said, okay, tell me more. And what he helped me understand was that I was sort of using social media as a megaphone, like so many of us can get trapped into doing, for me. And he said, you're not like that at all in real life. Your whole purpose is to serve other people. I know that's why you do what you do. And so I came away from that conversation with something that was so helpful and actually changed the way that I show up on social media. So that's the external self-awareness. So we've got internal self-awareness, those 3 questions, external self-awareness, the dinner of truth.
Nice. I'll try this.
Will you try it? Let me know how it goes. I promise it's always a surprisingly positive experience, which is always weird to me every time I do it.
You have said asking what instead of why changes everything. So how does this simple shift help leaders to handle stress and emotions more effectively?
This is one of the most important answers I'm going to give you. It's something that people all around the world that I've been lucky enough to speak to and work with have said it's been a game changer for them. And the way this first came about was we were early on in our research, we were looking at, I ran a study with like 300 people. And I asked them, how much time do you spend self-reflecting, introspecting, right? Like, why am I the way that I am? What are my motives? What are all these like unconscious things that Sigmund Freud told us that we should bring out? And then I looked at things like, were they happy? Were they anxious? Were they depressed? And I knew, because I was a self-awareness researcher, that the people who spent more time self-reflecting would be happier, healthier, less stressed, etc. I found the exact opposite. I found that the more that people self-reflected, they were more stressed, anxious, depressed, They were less satisfied with their lives, with their relationships, with their jobs. And I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I should be writing a book about self-delusion. Maybe, we should not think about ourselves. But as we dug into the transcripts from those 50 people I mentioned earlier, our self-awareness unicorns, we started to see a pattern. So I'm going to start with why questions can be dangerous. And then I'm going to talk about the difference of what questions. So there are two reasons that the research, mine and others, show can not only lead us away from self-awareness, but make our lives worse. So the first is, we sort of think about common why questions. We might be trying to understand a feeling, like, why am I so upset at my friend? Or we might be trying to understand an outcome. Why did that client meeting go so poorly? Or we might be trying to understand a skill that we have. Why can't I figure out pivot tables in Excel? And those also, it's what we've been taught, is to ask those questions and kind of dig deep. The problems are, number one, no matter how much we try, scientists have shown in the last several decades that we can't access so many of our unconscious thoughts and feelings and motives. And so what happens is we sort of dig in, we find an answer that feels true, and then we go with it. So, example, let's say I had an argument with my husband about how to load the dishwasher. And I say, gosh, why am I so angry? And so I dig into my unconscious and maybe I come up with an answer that's like, it's because I didn't have a good relationship with my father, and really, maybe I'm not even supposed to be in this relationship, and I sort of get so far away from what's actually happening, when maybe the real reason is my blood sugar's low and I haven't eaten enough today. But I glom onto that answer like it's true. So that explains the first reason we shouldn't ask why, is we get a false sense of confidence about the answer when we will not find the answer. The second reason asking why is dangerous, we've already seen, which is it kicks us down the rabbit hole of rumination. Why questions tend to focus on, why we're a victim, or they focus on, the problem to the point that we're not moving forward, or they focus on our deficiencies or limitations or fears. And so if you think about those two things, it's no wonder that people who are self-reflecting, asking why, were less self-aware and more, sort of worse off in general. So when we looked at our interview transcripts for our unicorns, we started to see this pattern that at first I thought was like, it didn't mean anything. We found that they were almost never asking themselves why questions and almost always asking what questions. So here's an example. Instead of, why am I so mad at my husband for the fight we just had? They might ask, what part of this do I own? Or we might say, what does this fight have in common with other fights that we've had in the past? Or we might say, what am I going to do differently next time? And so that's a great example of how when we even just shift from why to what, we become solutions focused, we become more empowered, and we become more action oriented. So that small change from why to what, it's made a huge difference for me. And I encourage everybody to give it a try. If it sounds too easy to be true, try it and see how it works.
Small change, but big results.
Exactly. That's what we want, right? We want simple tools that are going to totally change our lives. And I think this is one of them.
In bankable leadership, you said leaders can deliver both happy teams and strong results. What does being bankable in practice means?
I love this. So this is an old book. This is a book I published in 2013. The essence of being a bankable leader is that you perfectly balance a focus on getting things done, results, and engaging and motivating people, the people side. What I discovered in my research, and I think what most of us can just sort of see if we pay half attention, is that most leaders tend to prefer one of those things over the other. Some leaders are very results focused at the expense of people. Fewer leaders, but still many, are focused on people rather than results. And basically, the journey to become bankable starts with understanding your preference. So for me, I'll be honest, you might be surprised to hear this, maybe not. The people that work with me will not be surprised to hear it, but I am more of a results-focused leader. To become bankable, my job isn't to be any less results-focused. It's actually to say, okay, that's my default. What I actually need to do, if I'm writing an email to my team and I need something from them, I'm going to write the email, but then I'm going to ask the question, what can I do to have a better relationship with them through this email? Just very simply. And I might go back and notice that I didn't say something like, hi, how was your weekend? I just jumped into, I need you to do this for me. And so bankable leaders are very special because they do both. They don't sacrifice one at the expense of the other, but they know where they stand, they know their preference, and then they sort of slowly and methodically build skills in the other area. Same thing goes with the people-focused leader. If you're too people-focused, maybe the things you can work on are things like setting clear expectations or giving honest and candid feedback. Those are all part of the journey for people-focused leaders to become bankable.
Many managers, they fear being too kind will hurt the performance as well. How can leaders balance the compassion with high standards?
It's interesting. My colleague Brene Brown makes a distinction between nice and kind. And I almost feel like the word kind that you're using is more akin to what she sees as nice. And let me explain sort of what I mean by that. So nice is just just wanting people to be happy, being polite, saying what they want to hear so they don't get upset, not rocking the boat. If they ask, how's my new haircut? You say, oh, it's great, even if it's not great. Or, how about these shoes? Oh, I love them, even though you don't love them. That's what being nice is, essentially choosing your own comfort at the expense of a candid relationship. And I think we can all agree that, most of us don't want friends or leaders or colleagues who just tell us what we want to hear. Brene talks about kindness as being clear. She says, clear is kind. So when you're being kind, in sort of the best sense of the word, you are honoring the person, you're honoring the relationship, you're being all the things we've talked about, empathetic, emotionally intelligent, but you're also having an honest relationship with them. So, you're not going to say, those shoes are just so ugly, but you might be like, do you really want to hear? I like these better. Maybe you want to wear these shoes instead. And I think that distinction really matters for leaders because, especially people-pleasing leaders, it's going to come back to hurt you in the end. If you just tell everybody what they want to hear, you're going to have chaos. You're going to have anarchy. Nobody's going to tell you the truth. And at the end of the day, people are actually going to respect you less. So that's something to think about is when I'm nice, at the end of the day, it's eroding the very relationships I'm trying to protect. But when I'm kind, it's building those relationships.
Some leaders micromanage. How can they step back and give the ownership to their employees?
So my grandfather was a dairy farmer. And he has an expression that he would use where he would say, we let the cows roam, but we didn't let them wander off the farm. And I love that expression because it's a metaphor for what the best leaders do. Because there's sort of two sides of the spectrum. You talked about micromanagement, which is, keeping the cows in cages and never letting them go anywhere. The other side of the spectrum is just delegating and hoping that things are going to work out. You're not checking in. You're not setting clear expectations. So the middle ground there, I think for any leader who doesn't want to be a micromanager, who wants to empower their team more, is I'd give a couple pieces of advice. Number one, make sure that you are being crystal clear about your expectations. Right? So you're saying you're not going to dictate the process necessarily, because you're going to say, you're competent, I trust you, but this is the exact outcome. This is the product that I need. I'll personally tell you, in the spirit of we're all in this together, I am often accused by my team of expecting that they'll read my mind. If they, if I say, I just need this, and they give it to me and they say, well, you didn't tell me you wanted this, right? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is having check-ins with them. So when you assign them a task or a project, you might say, okay, let's talk about sort of how you're going to approach this. What do you think is a reasonable period of time for us to check in again? And keeping a list of, these are the things that I've delegated. This is the progress, because I think sometimes leaders just go too far to the other end where they do let them wander off the farm. And that is going to create different problems, but, a similar level of badness in terms of what you're getting from people. So clear expectations and frequent check-ins.
How can leaders celebrate the wins and show gratitude while pushing their teams for improvement?
This is one of my favorite concepts. It's called entitlement-free gratitude. And this actually comes from my book, Bankable Leadership, where if we are too people-focused in our and I'm going to explain this because this is going to sound controversial, but it's not. If we're too people-focused in the way we appreciate people, in the way we recognize them, show gratitude, then the results are going to suffer. Here's an example. I once had a friend who worked at a company, she's not there anymore, who had the team that they were in had the Employee of the Month award. And there were actually criteria for the award, right? It wasn't just, this is the manager's favorite person this month. That was, you've got to have these outcomes and, this sort of way of approaching work. And what would happen was the team was so dysfunctional that nobody would qualify for the Employee of the Month award, but they would still give it to someone anyway. So think about that. Think about what that leader was enforcing. They were saying, you get to have your picture up on this wall, and I don't know what they did, maybe they have a party for them or something, for being mediocre, for not meeting expectations. Another way that you can go overboard with recognition and gratitude is, sort of the peanut butter approach of like, everybody did a great job, instead of saying everybody did a great job, but I saw Fatima go out of her way, and I saw her, staying late for that client project, and I saw her doing, whatever it is she was doing. That is creating a standard that everybody else can strive towards. So I think the thing to prevent entitlement in terms of like what people expect, like why can't I be the Employee of the Month, is you've got to reward the behavior you want to see, and you have to have standards about it, right? You've got to be clear about it. And again, the more you can do that, you're not just going to get better results, you're going to have more motivated people.
Do happy employees really perform better?
Yes. Really, again, to keep this as simple as possible, it comes down to those three needs. I think we sometimes
have mentioned,
we complicate what leaders need to do sometimes, and leadership is complicated. It's complicated to lead people, but by asking something like, am I a need fueling leader, or am I a need frustrating leader? That can be a confronting question, but so important. And if you as a leader are focused on, and again, you're not just doing it to do it, you're doing it because you know that you're going to get happier people, better results. How can I help my employees feel more confident? Can I send them to training? Can I give them more feedback? Can I, again, recognize when they do something great? For choice, you mentioned work-life balance. I think this whole argument that we've been having for, 5 years now about hybrid work and in-person work and everyone has to come back to the office. I think we're asking the wrong questions about that. What we should be asking is, no matter what model of working we have, are we giving our employees an opportunity to choose? Are we giving them autonomy within that? And then connection is obviously the last one. Have you ever, can you think of a time that you have felt happy at work and not felt connected to the
Yeah.
people around you? It's kind of impossible, right? So that's another way. I believe that workplaces are actually not families because you can't fire your family.
Yes.
I believe they're communities. And if you can build a community where people feel safe, where they feel valued, where they feel belonging, that's, to me, those are the cornerstones of what happiness actually looks like. And if we go to the research, again, there's 50 years of research saying that when those needs are met, we are the best version of ourselves. And so that translates to performance, it translates to retention, it translates to safety, all of the things that leaders want to see.
How does leaders' self-awareness, knowing their strength and blind spots, affect their team's success?
So I actually just talked about this at His Highness's leadership conference today. There are a couple of dimensions of this, but we already know that self-aware leaders are more successful, they're more promotable, they're more empathetic, they're better communicators, they're more effective and respected leaders. I could go on and on and on. But even that list of things shows us why teams that are led by self-aware leaders tend to be happier, healthier, and better performers. So, you think about a self-aware leader who's empathetic. They're going to create psychological safety. And when teams feel safe, they can be candid. They can surface issues. They feel a sense of belonging with the team. They feel like, these are my people. I can be honest. I can be myself. They're also more motivated. If you have a leader who's self-aware, who's not getting in their own way, who knows what they stand for, who shares their values and says, my most important purpose in life is to make a positive difference, wouldn't you want to follow that person? So there's a lot of different elements to this, but self-aware leaders help their teams be successful. The other thing I'd say, just as kind of a postscript, is a team can only be as self-aware as their leader is self-aware.
That's very important.
Yeah, if they're not modeling that behavior, if they're not modeling vulnerability, humility, asking for feedback, sort of clarifying who they are and what they stand for, there's no way the team is going to spend the time and energy doing that. So the leader, we all know this, with great power comes great responsibility.
What are the most common blind spots you see in leaders?
I would say the most common blind spot that I see in the CEOs that I coach is the assumption that their team knows what their motives are. And what I mean by that is we judge our own behavior based on our intentions. And 99 times out of 100, leaders have good intentions. They might be acting like a jerk, but they're not trying to act like a jerk. Here's an example that really kind of explains this. So I worked with, this was probably 15 years ago, but I worked with a leader in the public sector who was the kind of the director of his division, very big, important job. And he had severe back problems. And they were getting worse over time. And what was happening was he would show up to these team meetings with, 20 or 30 people, and he would be in so much pain that he would not be listening to what was happening in the meeting. He'd be squirming around in his chair. He would sometimes stand up and leave because he had to walk around. And he knew that he was doing that because his back hurt. You know what his team thought? They said, this guy, he used to be the best boss ever, and now he hates us. He's checked out. He doesn't listen to our project updates. He gets up and leaves in the middle of meetings. And it was a very simple problem to correct in that instance. But I think it just illustrates so clearly that that was a blind spot for him. He knew that he knew what was causing that. It had nothing to do with the way he felt about his team, but his team was simply looking at the behavior. So what I tell leaders all the time, and I think this is something that can prevent a lot of blind spots, is especially when you're making an unpopular decision, or you're giving critical feedback, or you're doing something that the person that works with you is not going to be super thrilled about, is to start with your intention and say, listen, we've been working together for 5 years. The reason I hired you is you're super motivated, you're super talented, right? We're being kind and not nice. We're not making things up. And I wanted to share an observation with you in the spirit of your success. And then it's a totally different conversation than, what the heck were you saying in that meeting? Having that preface, having that intention. When you're announcing a decision, it's the same thing. Like I worked with a client actually who was doing a return to work during COVID, and a lot of their employees had moved out to different states in the US. And there are some very specific employment laws that prevented the company from paying people once the, COVID emergency ended that were in other states. But what did they do? They announced everyone who moved has to come back without saying, our hands are tied. We wish we didn't have to do this. Our intention is for you to have all the flexibility in the world. And guess what? Once I heard about that, I said, my goodness, we need to maybe send another email to everyone and have a conversation about it. But as soon as people heard that, they said, oh, that makes sense. You're not maliciously trying to control me. This is just, part of doing business. So I think it works sort of at the team level, and it also works at the organizational level.
Dr. Tasha, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Your questions were wonderful, and I was really happy to be here.
We too. Thank you.